And here we go. We have liftoff.
Propulsion continues to be nominal.
R68 chamber pressure looks good.
Following up. Roger, roger, planet.
Water towers fly! Yes!
Tango down to nominal.
Fighting outside FD off. Bring in FD off. It's orange!
Oh my god! Oh my god!
Decollage.
Put that in the big bag, Eagle.
343 unfolds to go.
Indeed.
We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
This methane will be igniting with the flare, correct?
Yikes. You good? We don't need any more of these.
5.
All right, y'all, you know the drill. It is Sunday. It is time at roughly 3 p.m. What are we? We're not launching rockets or anything here. It's like we have a window we're supposed to hit. If you can hear me and see me, you have joined Intrepid Museum's Astro Live show for this month. I am Das. You may know me as that. You may know me as John Galloway as well. But we are going to be talking with some very interesting folks today. Sort of try to make a habit of that here on the Astro Live shows with the Intrepid Museum, talking with folks from the Human Landing System teams over at NASA. And if you know what HLS is, you know why that is probably very interesting to lots of folks here on the channel. Quick housekeeping. This is a museum show, so we are doing this with Intrepid Museum today. You may be watching this a lot of different places. You may be on the museum's Facebook or their YouTube channel. You may be watching it live on X somewhere, or you're over on one of the NSF channels. You know where to find us. You may even still be on Twitch. Who knows these days, folks over on Twitch. But wherever you're watching from, hang out with us. See if you can learn a little bit about NASA's HLS program with the coming up Artemis missions that are working on putting boots back on the moon. Now, you'll see a couple other things here with the show today. Number one, Astro Live is supported through a NASA cooperative agreement awarded to the New York Space Grant Consortium. And number two, you'll see that we are fundraising to also help support Intrepid Museum's educational programs today. So if you're over on the NASA Spaceflight YouTube channel, you may see a button, not doing super chats or anything like that, but you can support the museum's educational outreach by clicking the button and doing the dope. That is technically a donation if you click that button. Not going to be reading out those or anything like that, but thank y'all so much for the support. Just another good way that we can continue to bring this sort of content to folks everywhere, right? So do we get 5x5s? I think we did get 5x5s. Yeah, we got some 5x5s. Shall we move on with the rest of the show here and introduce our fabulous guests who have taken time out of their weekends to talk to us about going back to the moon? It's not really a question. We're going to do that anyways. Here are other folks that are here with us today. Of course, you've seen Elisa Siegel's face before. Elisa, how you doing?
Hey, doing great. So excited to be back here talking about a really exciting topic, HLS. We cannot wait to dive in with our amazing guests today.
This is like the topic Elisa's been excited about all year. She's like, HLS is coming up. December's going to be HLS.
It felt like a long shot, honestly. At the beginning of the year, we were like, I don't know, can we get anyone? But we were able to. Thank you guys for being here.
Speaking of which, absolutely, we've got Logan Kennedy and Catherine Crow with NASA's HLS program. So we're going to get into y'all's backgrounds and stuff like that, sort of learn how you got into this in just a second. But I want to start with a huge question, right? I've jokingly said, like, today, this is a show where we're going to see all the new renders from all the launch providers that have never been released before. And right here at the top, that's not really how things work, is it?
No,
It's not.
Yeah, so our program is actually a really interesting one because it's not just about making like huge strides in exploration. It's also about making huge strides like within the space industry. So
Right.
working on the program, our main goal is actually to facilitate and enable our providers to be able to build up their business model and their technology and their hardware designs. So a big part of our job is actually helping them protect their industry secrets, so to speak. So we have to be really careful in terms of letting our providers choose how they would like to talk about their technology in the public sphere. So we're really just here to be enablers.
And that's really a different thing. Like, so many people are so used to the way that NASA historically used to do things, is a good way to say it. NASA was building everything themselves, and you would go to NASA and you would ask, like, oh, show us these. You're government funded. You should show us all this stuff. But with the new commercial agreements and the way that you work with these third-party providers, NASA is owning sort of the mission and the requirements now, but not necessarily the specific solutions to the things that you need. So some of this technology, like a render, it's no longer really NASA's to give away. It's the provider, SpaceX, Blue Origin's, to give away, but that's not for y'all to give away, right?
Right. And like, we never, unlike previous human spaceflight programs, we actually never take ownership of the vehicle. The designs aren't ours. We're really working with them to set them up as service providers who can help us fly our missions and meet the overall agency goals.
See,
so
that makes sense. There's a lot of different analogies we can go with here, right? But I think this is probably one of the most important things, so that people sort of understand this new way of NASA working on these sort of projects, where it's not just all NASA doing everything, all NASA all the time, right? So I wanted to talk about that up here at the very top. And we had some different analogies we were kicking around, like how does this work? One that we sort of came up with was, well, if I need to get in a taxi and I need to go to Intrepid Museum to do a show, we're doing Kids Week, we're doing Space and Science Festival or something, it would be weird if the viewers of the show asked me when my taxi's oil was changed. Like, exactly. Wait a second. I just got in the taxi and I made it to the museum. If Alicia, I got to the museum and you asked me that question, I'd look at you like you were crazy. I was like, what?
I'm going to have to remember to do that when you come back for
So here, like, engaging with the service providers, like you said, you're owning the mission, but not the vehicle. It is very much the level of detail sort of different. But Logan, we were talking about this sort of rental car, taxi, whatever analogy, where NASA is going out there and they're getting these services from folks. It doesn't mean that you don't care whether or not the oil was changed, right?
Right. So the rental car analogy, it's imperfect, but it works pretty well. We have a destination we want to go to. We want to go hit certain places on the way there. We want to make sure the rental car is big enough to hold the people we want and the gear that we want. It's got to be full of fuel and capable of going so far. But beyond that, yeah, we don't care, what part they're using or whatever inside the car. It's up to them. And if they want to innovate and they have, then that's okay with us as long as they meet our requirements.
I think that makes sense. We'll talk a little bit about this more, but think about it, folks. Like, it's not the fact where I need to get somewhere, so I'm going to start from scratch and mine some iron and then build and design a car, and then I'm going to drive the car somewhere. And then that's not how it's working anymore. Now NASA is going out and sort of saying, hey, we need a ride over here. Here's what we need to carry. Here's how we need to get there. We want to make sure that it's safe. It has these different things. So some questions that we can focus on today are going to be less about, show us this super secret render of how, company A or company B is going to do something, and more about what requirements were given that need to be satisfied to make sure that we can get boots back on the moon, right? So where can we hop in there? Like where can we talk about how NASA designs these requirements to get us back to the moon? And how do you communicate those? Is like a huge document you slap on somebody's desk and you're like, make me a moon rocket?
That's actually kind of exactly how it goes. So it may seem like a slightly less like sexy side of spaceflight, but it's equally as important. And so Logan and I have both been fortunate enough to be on the program since just about the very beginning. So we went through the process of trying to formulate and write those requirements. And I feel like, at least for me, it's made me a much better engineer, because a lot of times we think about trying to start with the design solution versus like really understanding the problem it is that we're trying to solve. So the way that we figured out to be able to go about this is you start by really focusing on what the core things are that you want to do. So for our program, the first thing was just what you said at the very beginning. It's land boots on the moon. And the first woman and the first person of color, and be able to stay there for a certain duration. And that is the end goal. And so then we started working backwards from there. So we kind of laid out like what it took to get from Earth to the moon. And then you sort of start identifying different design constraints, whether it's something that comes from like Orion, because we dock to Orion in lunar orbit before we go down to the surface, and Orion is essentially already designed.
Right.
So we had to make all of our processes and designs and mission planning work within what Orion was capable of. And so you start by like identifying what your constraints are. And then once you get what we call the concept of operations laid out, which is just understanding like everything that the general high level things that have to happen all the way through the whole mission, you identify what functions have to be performed to be able to satisfy that. So like an easy one is to get from the lunar orbit down to the surface, you have to be able to do a burn to depart the surface.
Right.
But that's kind of like a lower level function. So once we had that general set of functions defined, we then had to figure out how to bring it up to the highest level possible, so that we could allow the providers as much space to innovate as humanly possible. Like the entire objective was not to overspecify anything that we didn't absolutely have to require for the mission. And so it was a really tricky process to be able to come up with our core set of requirements.
I mean, I'm going to keep going back to this because I think that it really does work. If I need a ride to the Intrepid Museum from the airport, I don't specify like, oh, well, I need it to be this car and it needs to be this color. And when you take right turns, you should take right turns like this, or run your blinker for 5 seconds before taking the turn. Like all of these different sort of details. I just care about safely getting myself to the museum so I can do the show.
Right.
Right. And that's sort of what you're talking about there. You're talking about the requirements. You're not going to get in the car and be like, well, all right, nope. Now up here, you need to slow to 3 miles per hour before you take the right turn. Like you just say, get me to the surface of the moon, get me to the Intrepid Museum safely.
But then one of the tricky parts for us is we also have to keep the humans safe.
Right.
And so, there's a huge base of experience that NASA has in terms of how to keep humans safe while doing, dangerous and challenging spaceflight missions. So the vast majority of our requirements are actually all of they specify all the things that we know are necessary to keep humans safe in space. So
Gotcha.
like what kind of what are the basic life support conditions do we need? What are the types of acceleration loads that can be imparted on the crew? What are different food and this turns out to be one of the more challenging parts of spaceflight. Waste management capabilities are required to keep the humans healthy, and so that ends up being like a pretty important part of how we work with the providers, is just working to make sure that all of that experience can be leveraged to conduct the mission.
Is that where sort of our analogy breaks down a little bit? So help me out. I keep saying I'm getting in a taxi and they're taking me somewhere, but is this more like the rental car where you're getting in and you're driving it yourself, or how does that break down technically?
It's even more complicated than that. So the end goal is like the rental car / taxi sort of model. It's kind of in between.
Is it a self-driving rental car maybe?
Something because we do have autonomous requirements. So it does have to be able to conduct the mission without crew intervention, but also allow crew intervention, which that one's always fun to implement. But where we currently are, we're kind of trying to do a bunch of things in parallel. We're trying to get to the taxi / rental car state, but we're also kind of figuring out the auto safety standards at the same time.
Gotcha. Let me see. I'm trying to think of the right way to put that. Like this, maybe when I say you have to slow down to this fast before you're taking the turn, that is something that you're interested in, because if you slam on the brakes and you don't want to give the astronauts whiplash or whatever, right? So NASA's experience in designing those systems is important. What sort of acceleration loads a human will be comfortable with in space, and so you sort of
doing all the crash keep it. Okay, I have you back.
Yes, we might have had just a quick hiccup there, but I think we have you back.
Okay, sorry about that. Yay, calling in from the woods of Vermont. But anyway, so you're trying to learn how to do all that crash test simulation stuff. But then it's like if you had to not only take the taxi, but you had to have another taxi riding alongside of you the whole way. that was like 3 inches away without touching and be able to like have that kind of interaction with another car outside of the car that you're in, but without knowing, communicating too much about one car to the other car. In terms of like trying to be able to integrate things like Orion and Gateway with the lander. So the end goal is the taxi, but where we currently are, there's a whole lot of complications to trying to get to that point.
This is almost like, imagine 3 rental cars, right? And we need this rental car to autonomously get itself to this location and park itself. But then we're going to get in this rental car and we're going to drive over here and meet you. But then this other rental car also needs to meet us there. And then we need to get these 2 rental cars to park really close to each other so that our crew can get out of rental car A into rental car B. And then rental car B is going to drive, like, it's a little more complicated, I guess.
Right. And then all the cars have to be able to talk to each other, but like the developers of each car can't know about the details of like the other car that it's talking to.
Is this, I think we may have an animation that attempts to show some of this here. Are these the concept of operations? What was this animation?
Logan, do you want to talk?
Logan's nodding.
Yep. So this is a ConOps animation concept of operations for Artemis 3. And it starts there on the left with Starship propellant depot launching into Earth orbit. And then you'll see multiple tanker flights there refilling that depot. And then the last piece of that is the actual lander, the Starship lander that we're working on all these requirements going up and getting refilled by the depot. And then once that lander is in the NRHO orbit, safely checked out, then we commit to the SLS Orion launch. The crew in Orion meet up with the lander. 2 crew go from Orion over to the lander. 2 crew stay on Orion around in Earth and lunar orbit. And then 2 crew go to the surface, perform their EVAs, do all the fun stuff, pick up all the rocks, come back up to Orion, and then Orion comes home.
There's slightly less animation in this animation than I anticipated, but it's all good. Let's continue to lean into the rental car. So if we're looking at this, this is basically, all right, this car is going to drive itself to a place, orbit, right? And then we need you to make sure the rental car refills itself, right?
Yeah. So all the stuff that happens,
with other rental cars.
The HLS lander, that last one there, I guess the 5th one from the left, is the rental car. All the stuff to the left of it is all stuff that happens to the rental car before we even get there.
Before you even get there.
That is not what we didn't dictate what has to happen or any. There's a couple requirements about how long it could take, how long it can loiter in lunar orbit before the crew can get there, because we know we want the ability to be robust to when SLS launches and how long it takes to get to orbit.
Right.
But yeah, the rental car, there's only 2 rental cars in this picture. It's Orion and it's the HLS Starship, and everything else is just loosely, contractually managed.
Gotcha. So I'm like I said, I'm leaning into this. You said you need to deliver a rental car that's got enough fuel in it to this location so that we can drive up the mountain, down the mountain, whatever, right? And all of this other stuff, you didn't specify, well, it needs to refuel itself, it needs to do this. Your requirement was get us a rental car to this location that we can use to do this, right?
Yeah.
And the other rental car that I work a lot with isn't really shown on there is the spacesuit. So I'm the surface lead for HLS. So when we're on the surface of the moon, that's my domain. And again, that spacesuit, which is Axiom, they're contracted for the first mission, we have requirements, and it's another task. We again don't take ownership of the suit. There you go.
There you go.
So there's a rental car inside a rental car, and yeah, it's a little bit complicated. But again, we gave that group a bunch of requirements on what we want to do on these lunar missions, and it meets those requirements.
Well, that's one of the interesting things about spacesuits too. Like you hear like suit, and you think it's maybe not like the same level of complexity or as big of a thing as the lander, but the suits are really like mobile spacecraft that have to let you be able to walk inside of them. So it's just as, even though it's not as like large as the lander and doesn't have rocket engines on it, Logan can tell you more about it, but I would say it's definitely as complex and definitely as important of a piece as the lander itself.
I could totally get behind this. I hope there's not a PAO somewhere rolling their eyes when I say, if you're designing a spacecraft, you probably, like, the provider gets to figure out what the engines are and the thrusters are and all that sort of stuff. But if you're designing a space suit, you have to have the motive force of the suit, like the engine, the power plant of the suit for moving it around, is literally the meat popsicle inside that the suit is protecting. That's my terminology, not NASA's terminology, by the way. But you have to work within that as your engine, I guess, to move the suit around. So it could theoretically be a lot more complicated, I guess, huh?
Yeah. And my background is in robotics, where you don't have the squishy human inside, and things get so much more complicated. Catherine was talking about our requirement set. We were very proud of ourselves that we had, it was like 20 or 30 requirements for the vehicle, high level requirements, but then there were many, like hundreds more just to keep the humans alive and keep them comfortable. Well, the spacesuit from the ground up has humans inside, of course. And yeah, keeping them, they're sweaty, they're going to the bathroom, they have to be, there's all kinds of requirements about how mobile they have to be, right? We want to be able to do lots of good science on the moon and drill and pick up rocks and deploy payloads and things. And yeah, that's involved from the beginning, and making good progress on the Axiom side.
Gotcha. So look, we're not going to do like a game where you count every time DOS says the word rental car, but I'm really leaning into the rental car here. Like I really think that it helps it make a little bit more sense, because people just don't understand that. They think like, oh, well, this is NASA. NASA should tell us everything. And they have all this detail, and you're trying to not do that. You're trying to rely on, or not trying to, you are relying on these commercial providers to provide the solutions and leave them room open to be flexible and innovative, like the terminology you use, right, Catherine?
It's really hard too. Like for NASA itself, this represents a huge culture change. Like it's hard to emphasize exactly like the kind of paradigm shift that we're undergoing right now. And I wish the public could hear how many times like in meetings, like we'll be talking about like trying to solve like how we're going to solve some problem. And there's a lot of times where we have to stop ourselves and go, okay, no, this isn't NASA's problem to solve. Like we're trying to enable the providers. And so we have to let them be able to solve the problem. And so it's definitely, coming from like traditional NASA engineering, it's a huge shift in how we think about managing programs, designing missions, solving problems. Like it's really been an interesting challenge to learn how to like switch from directly managing hardware to being more of the mission enabler, and then working to let these providers have enough space to really grow into the service that we're asking for from them.
Yeah. So we've jumped right into this, and I want to get a little bit more technical detail about some of the operations and the way that NASA is preparing for it and working on it so that we're ready to do it. But I skipped over. We didn't really talk about where y'all came from, like what your areas of expertise and stuff like that are. So Catherine, let's start with you. What are you involved with HLS, Artemis, however many Artemises we're going to have, right? Where do you sort of fit in? What do you manage or work with in the program?
So I'm our integrated performance lead. So the team that I run, like we do everything from mission planning, like the concept of operations for the lander, to the like we work with the providers on the trajectory design for the mission. But we also like work in areas such as like natural and induced environments, but really like our main focus is on making sure that we have a mission design that we can fly, and that working with the providers to make sure that there's enough vehicle performance available to us to be able to achieve our mission objectives. So we spend a lot of our time working with both the provider and Moon to Mars to help craft the end-to-end mission.
Craft the end-to-end mission. Like
yes.
That means, like, what level of detail does that get down to? Because we've talked about, we're sort of not worrying about some of the details, but when you say crafty in the end mission, that's, we're going here, we're doing this, we need to get here. Like, what does that mean, really?
So that's one of the things that makes the integrated performance role kind of interesting on HLS, is that we are one of the few teams that is directly involved in the mission design and analysis process. So where the providers, manage the hardware design and analysis, we're actually working hand in hand with them to do the detailed trajectory analysis, starting with what we call 3 degrees of freedom, all the way down to like 6 degree of freedom analysis, which is super, super detailed for things like docking. And then we actually manage the mission baseline for the program. So as detailed as you can think of in terms of mission planning, like all the way like down to the minute, timeline analysis and all sorts of different stuff. Like we do actually work down to that lower level for the mission design side. And then we're the main integrators back with like the similar mission teams from each of the vehicles, and then Moon to Mars, who does the overall integration between Orion and HLS and Gateway and the suits to manage the mission.
So you said 3 degree, 6 degree, like you're just talking about the level of detail that you're planning. And I'm going to make this up, but 3 degree might be like, we need to dock, right? It's a very high level, very general sort of thing. And as you get more detailed, it's like, here's the exact time frames that need to happen. And I'm making this up. Am I close?
Not quite, but almost.
Okay. What's a good way to think about that?
Yeah. So when you're doing trajectory analysis, in just about any area of analysis for a mission this long and large and complicated, one of your biggest constraints is how long it takes to do the analysis. Like we've gotten to a point with computers and different software suites that we can analyze down to an amazing level of detail for almost any specific problem. But when you're in the earlier stages of mission design, you have to look at a whole bunch of different use cases and variations across specific mission dates and like different conditions on the vehicle, and you can't analyze everything. So for those broader, like in the case of trajectory, which is the flight path that we fly on, we use simplified models to be able to, do the math to create the flight profiles across the widely varying cases.
Okay.
But then for dynamic operations, such as landing or docking with Orion, because docking is actually one of the most complex things that we do. You want to really get in and look at the detailed variations of movement, as well as like impulses, such as like venting or off gassing or all those little things that might influence how the vehicle moves in space.
Okay.
So that you can make sure that you stay within your envelopes of the types of motions that the vehicle can have for each stage. And so 6 degree of freedom that's the type of flight dynamics analysis that we do for where we need those really detailed close-in cases to make sure that it really will work at the end of the day.
Gotcha. All right. So you're sort of more, what's the right way to say it? Like you're planning the mission, like all these different phases of the mission where you're actually getting out there and then getting down to the surface. And then we go to Logan. And Logan, you're the lead for the surface operations. What's your title?
Just surface lead.
Surface lead.
Yeah. So once we land on the surface, I'm involved in what happens at the end there. There's a lot of complications as far as where we're picking our landing site. What are we going to do when we get there? What are we bringing with us, and what are we bringing back? That's one of the areas that I specialize in. And then we're on the surface for about a week with our 2 crew. And our main goal is to do EVAs and do as much science as we can. We'll be doing science on board the vehicle, IVA science, so inside the vehicle, and then EVA science. Some of that is going to be picking up rocks and bringing them home like we did on Apollo. I very oversimplified that process. It's a very complicated geology process. Yeah, I've done some geology training now as part of the EVA world, and it is fascinating how they do geology on the moon. I'm a big Apollo buff, and I thought it was really, really interesting watching those EVAs. But now that I have some understanding of what they're actually doing, they put us out in the Arizona desert, and we were supposed to drive around with our rover driver and go perform EVAs and figure out what the geological history was of these craters near Arizona.
Right. And
it was just insane. And that's what they're doing on the moon. We're trying to understand the geological processes that formed the moon and thus formed Earth. I work in that world, making sure that the interface between the suit and the lander is up to snuff. So we have those original requirements. We have keep the human alive requirements, and then we have interface requirements. So how we interface with the suit, how we interface with Orion, etc. And it's a complicated interface, as you might understand. You have to have one spacecraft interfacing and refilling and talking to another spacecraft that is the suit. So I make sure all that stuff is going to happen. And then, of course, make sure the vehicle is healthy while we're on the surface so we can use it to get home.
So when you say that, is that like, let's see, I'm trying to think. When astronauts are going on a crewed mission, we see them going out to the pad, and in Apollo, they'd be carrying those little air conditioner things, right? The suit power packs or conditioners. And then these days we see them like plug into the car that they're getting into if they're going out there. But when you say that, you're talking about the suit that they're in, the EVA suit, actually has a part where it interfaces, like it gets plugged into a rover or the ship or whatever. Is that the interface you're talking about? Or is it more like here is how an astronaut interfaces with the suit? Like, which one of those interfaces is it?
Yeah, so it's both. We have two documents that cover each. One is a more compatibility requirement, so making sure that we have translation corridors and we're not going to have sharp edges and things that'll snag your hand. It's kind of a safety type requirement, making sure we can actually operate near the vehicle. One of those, the two that are most important to me, one is dust. The moon is dusty. You probably have heard about this, and
the dust is sharp.
Is sharp, and it's a problem. So we have how much dust the suits can bring back in, and therefore how much dust the vehicle can handle. And then the other one is an emergency ingress requirement. So if we have something go wrong on the surface, we require that the crew are able to get back inside within 10 minutes, and ideally less than that. Those are the compatibility requirements. But then the other side of it is, the actual umbilical connections, how it's bolted to the wall, how it's stored, how it's powered, how fast we can recharge the oxygen and the water inside. So two big areas of interface.
Gotcha. And so in both of those places, you're not just saying we need to be able to walk on the moon and bend over to pick up a rock or whatever. Like, there are more detailed requirements about how that human-shaped spacecraft works.
Yeah, and a lot of it is based on the space station, right? So we have a ton of EVA experience there, and what your work envelope is. On the space station, you're crawling along with your arms, or you're attached by your feet to the robotic arm.
Right.
And we use a lot of that knowledge and a lot of that testing and training from the big pool, the NBL, to a bunch of other facilities we have around the world. Zero gravity flights and things, and trying to figure out how to apply that to the moon. We have a ton of Apollo experience. But not all of it is apples to apples. It's a different suit that has different requirements. We want to be more mobile. I've seen them do yoga in the new suit. It is a very, very capable suit. Yeah. I always say that doing an EVA on the moon is like doing a bunch of hard yard work inside of a stiff balloon. So if you go out and do yard work for 8 hours a day, you're going to be pretty sore afterwards. You're not going out there bench pressing a bunch of stuff, but you're bending over and you're picking things and you're digging things, and it's hard on your body. Well, put yourself inside of a stiff balloon and do that for 8 hours, and we're going to do that 4 times.
Gotcha. And folks, as we go through here, I am going through and pulling out some of the questions from chat. If you have a question, you know what to do. Tag us in chat at NASA Spaceflight or at whatever on another channel. I'm trying to pull from as many different places as I can. But Alicia, if you could continue the conversation here. I'm going to go over and pull some questions out of chat and prepare a couple things here.
Absolutely. All right. Well, so a question that kind of is a good intersection, I think, for what both of you guys do. A lot of people, they hear we're going back to the moon. That's so exciting. I don't know if people fully understand, though, where we're going on the moon. We're not going back to the Apollo 11 landing site. We are now going to the South Pole, right? So I'd love for you guys to be able to talk about just why the South Pole was selected, what is so special about that area, and what are they going to be specifically looking for there? How does HLS kind of intersect with the terrain there and all those considerations as well? Anyone, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a really good area to talk about. So during Apollo, we went to the equator portion of the moon. So in this picture, the widest part right there around the center. And like Elise said, this time we're going back to the South Pole of the moon. And the reason why that area is special is we have imagery data of the moon that seems to indicate that we have water ice at the South Pole. And as anybody who's been camping or backpacking knows, humans can't get very far without water, but water is heavy and difficult to be able to carry enough with you. And so what we're really trying to do is to be able to get our crew members down to the south pole of the moon so they can access what we call permanently shadowed regions. So the moon, because it doesn't have an atmosphere or anything to really protect it, all of the meteorites and those sorts of things that essentially like run into the moon don't burn up like they do on Earth. So the moon has a ton of impact craters all over the surface. And so inside some of those craters, they're just deep enough and at the right angle where the sun can never reach the inside. So there's areas that are permanently dark. It's like the inside of a cave kind of, except like in a crater. And those areas seem to still have some water ice that's present in them because they don't get exposed to the warmer temperatures on the moon's surface that can go up as high as above 150 degrees Celsius. So it gets a little warm in the sunlit areas. So the real goal is to be able to have our crew members, like Logan was talking about, go walk around on the surface and eventually be able to get down into one of those craters and access that water, so that we can kind of, be able to understand like what the particular conditions of that water are, and also start learning how we can leverage ice deposits, such as what the imagery has shown is present on the moon.
So ultimately, long term, then, you could take that water ice. Sure, we could drink it, I guess, if it's clean and clean it. But also you can extract it apart too, right? So you could use it as a sustainable resource.
Well, and then it's really interesting, but one of our most common rocket propellant combinations is it's kind of non-intuitive, but it's actually hydrogen and oxygen. And so water is made up of hydrogen and oxygen molecules. So there's also a school of thought and people researching the idea of being able to take those water molecules and break them apart into hydrogen and oxygen that could then potentially be used for propellant purposes. So there's a lot of potential applications for the water that's on the South Pole.
That's so interesting. And I mean, also though, in terms of the location, you've got this water ice. I would imagine it looks very different as well. And I'm really curious, and obviously with the HLS, when it's landing, you got to make sure you find a nice, I guess, smooth spot or something. How are you picking the different potential sites that you'll actually be landing HLS on?
It's pretty complicated, actually. So you've got to look at a bunch of different constraints, kind of. So like the vehicle can only handle so much of a inclination when it's landing, and so that's like slope plus craters plus rocks and boulders. So we have to really spend a lot of time studying the terrain to be able to identify those hazards. But then one of the big challenges is we actually have fairly low resolution imagery of the moon's surface. And so we can only detect like hazards on the scale of meters. So we spend a lot of time trying to interpret the surface data we have to get the best identification of hazards possible. But then, especially for the first mission, we just due to vehicle navigation, we need a spot that's lit on the surface of the moon. And just like on Earth, the moon has day and night cycles that it goes through. That's why we have like new moons through full moons from our perspective here on Earth. But we need a certain amount of light along our flight path and like where we're landing in order for the sensors to be able to work. Which sounds fairly easy, except when you're operating at the South Pole, the sun comes in from a super low angle. And so where you might have like, what you consider like a fairly small boulder here, it casts really long shadows. And so any sort of ridges or hills you have cast everything behind them into dark. So it's not just as simple as looking at like day and night. And then the other big thing that we have to look at is the ability for the lander to have a field of view to like a communication asset. We're working to be able to get a comm relay in orbit around the moon, but for right now, we really need the lander's comm system to still be able to see Earth so that we can have that direct with Earth comm so that mission control and the crew can still talk to each other.
So this is a really complex equation then to figure out these sites. You need the shadows so that you can find the cold, a water ice that's never seen the light of day. You need light so that you can power, your power cells and everything at the same time. I assume, that has to do with like temperature variations too, if you've got long daylights and things like that. You need a somewhat flat surface, to be able to land on. And you need a line of communication and sight. There's so many different things that go into this. But that's fascinating to be able to do that. That's why we have smart people like you to figure out where all that is. But it also is really interesting to me. You're saying that the sun is very low on the horizon at the South Pole. You get these long, shadows and everything. I feel like as, us viewing it at home, when we finally see these pictures of the moon, they're going to look very different than what we saw from the Apollo era, right? How will everything look different in the pictures that we see at the lunar South Pole?
Logan, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's going to look very strange, and we're already training to see what that looks like and how to, not only what the pictures look like, but how to navigate and how to perform our EVAs in this very different environment. There's pictures out there, you can go find them, for a series of tests where we went to Arizona again, and we brought a giant cart. We performed the EVAs at night, brought a giant cart that looked like the sun, because if you have a boulder and you're looking to walk behind it, you don't know what's behind it because the shadow is so long, and there could be something dangerous behind it. It should be a hole, there could be another rock to trip over. So they're going to look very strange. They're going to be very, very long shadows. The crew are either going to be looking downrange in line with these long shadows, or they're looking up this way and the sun's going to be right in their eyes. On Apollo, the sun was always relatively overhead, and you didn't want to look that way, and we did burn a camera out in Apollo because we pointed at the sun. But having the sun be 2 degrees above the horizon the entire time, it's going to look very, very strange. So we're already starting our training now to make sure we can get back. We want to be able to walk up to 2 kilometers away from the vehicle on this first mission, and being able to navigate in this strange environment. Luckily, Starship is pretty big, so we can see it from pretty far away. But so the later missions with Blue Origin, still a big vehicle, and doing navigation without having, compasses and things don't work on the moon is challenging. So the pictures will be very exciting.
So yeah, in terms of the communications, then also, I know we are, a few years out now still maybe, but in terms of what that would look like, again, for us at home, what do you know any of the plans for that? Like, are they going to be live streaming 24/7, in 4K from the moon, or, just taking pictures and sending them back? Now technology is so much more advanced than it was in the 60s and 70s. So what is the, amount of time that's going to take for us to be able to see these images in real time? What is our experience here on Earth going to be like that's different from these?
This is such a fascinating thing. It keeps me up at night sometimes. When I think of Apollo, people think about the film camera pictures we got back, and they're beautiful, right? That's not what you got real time. In real time, you got grainy black and white video, because that was the bandwidth limitations at the time. So we're going to do better than that. But real time 4K video is extremely challenging, especially on the South Pole of the moon. When you're communicating to Earth, but it's close to the horizon, there's something called multipath that just means that you can't get as much bandwidth as you would like. So we're going to do our best. We have requirements for sending back high definition video. We will be live streaming from the moon. Is it going to be 480, 720, 1080, 4K? I don't think we know those details right now.
I think we'll take anything. That's amazing. Right. Are you kidding?
We will be live streaming, and we'll be sending down pictures as well.
I know with NSF, we've got 24/7 live streams from the Cape and from Starbase and from all the places. Can we get a camera on the moon with you guys too? That'd be amazing.
Yes. We will have
right on that.
We'll have tons of cameras.
We'll write it down on our bucket list.
Here you go.
And not all of it is for the public. A lot of it's for science, right? So when we're doing EVAs, we need to take pictures of the rocks we're about to pick up, send it down, and that is going to be high resolution. So we can decide, well, do we take a chunk of it? Do we take the whole thing? So we'll have high resolution imagery coming down in real time too. And yeah, sharing that with the public will be one of our primary goals.
That's amazing. Dustin, did you grab any questions?
Oh my gosh.
Oh, I can imagine. All right, here we go.
Did I grab any questions? Real quick, before we hop into the questions, I think it took us a second to grab, but the photo Kevin's got up here is actually from some of that testing that y'all were doing, I think in Arizona. Is this Arizona? Yeah, I think that's from Arizona, right?
Yeah, so this is there's a whole series of tests that we're doing. Some of it will eventually be, once the Artemis 3 astronauts get picked, they'll be doing a ton of stuff. But this is just learning how either the new suits work. Of course, we have a rover in this picture. That's for the later missions. We really like getting that thing out in the field though, and seeing what those later missions look like. That's one area we haven't really touched on yet is how the Artemis program evolves over time. We start off with just one lander going, Starship is for Artemis 3 and Artemis 4.
Yep.
Blue Origin is for Artemis 5. And then beyond that, we'll have 2 qualified vehicles to go. We'll start bringing rovers. So the LTV rover is in their procurement process right now. And then we'll eventually get things like habitats and pressurized rovers. There you go. That's a good picture there. So it's an evolution over time. It's all about sustainability. That's one of the main reasons we're going to the South Pole, is because there are areas that are there that are lit for most of the year, as opposed to the equator, which is 2 weeks of sunlight and 2 weeks of very cold darkness where you can't generate power. The South Pole has some prime locations for this where we're going to set up. So the mission evolving over time is fascinating.
All right. So we were just looking at a couple renders and we saw the Arizona image. And so I've got a question over here about astronaut training. Is astronaut training in y'all's purview, or do you sort of like work with it? Here's the systems and now somebody else is training the astronauts on it. How does that responsibility break down?
Yeah, so astronaut training, as you might imagine, is done mostly by Houston. That's where the astronauts are. They have a ton of facilities down there. We're tangentially involved. So here's a great picture of one, not necessarily crew training for the mission. So the actual training for the mission will be after crew gets selected. And once we know a little bit more, it's maybe 2 years out or so from the mission. I forget the dates.
Right.
But what we've already started doing is a version of training. We're familiarizing ourselves with the suits and the system as much as we can. This picture is from the Starship elevator. So you can see 2 crew there in mock-up suits. They're not, the real suits. Learning how we're going to get to and from the surface using this elevator, which as the surface lead is a fascinating and also very, it's a very complicated system. Well, not complicated. It's just, it has to work. It's not what we did on Apollo. It's a new system. I think about this thing a lot, and luckily we're building full-scale mock-ups and testing it for years. We've done this since 2020.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot of progress on how this thing works, and so training is ongoing.
So I from a requirements perspective, right? I think a lot of people think the same thing about an elevator that might be on a design. What happens? Like, Alicia, you live in New York. You ever been stuck in an elevator?
Yes.
Like,
elevators break down here all the time.
Hopefully,
I'm not wishing that on you
elevators-
guys at all, but
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
Moon elevators slightly better than New York City elevators, hopefully. But
But
from
there's stuff to
requirements,
think about there. Wait, because like gravity is slightly different. So like descending down, like there's stuff to think about with elevators on the moon, for sure.
it's like
So
an
the way
entire
we-
area of discussion. Go ahead.
So the way we manage that, and that this is a great example of needing to be able to pull the requirements up to the highest level possible, right? Like your first instinct is probably to sit down if you're trying to like develop requirements for the elevator, is to say, okay, I need it to go this speed, I need it to be this size, I need it to look like this and do this specific thing. But if you're trying to facilitate innovations from the providers, you don't want to specify all that up front. But we are very concerned, like you guys were just talking about, like we definitely don't want a stuck elevator on the surface of the moon, both because, especially for the first missions where we only send 2 crew down, there's nobody in the lander to help them get back up. But also we have very tight time constraints on certain portions of the mission. So you have to have the crew be able to get back inside the lander within a certain time frame. So what we ended up doing is we wrote what we call like fault tolerance and reliability requirements. And so we wrote requirements that, the elevator still has to be able to work, even if some sort of failure happens, or you need to be able to meet a certain like reliability metric, that there's only like a very tiny percentage of a chance of the overall system failing, and you kind of grade that with like test data and analysis data and all sorts of things. So because the core need is for the crew to be able to get back in the lander. And so we as the government we had to work hard to get to this point, but what we ended up deciding is we don't specify any of the design details to be able to make sure that the crew can safely get back inside. We specify those higher level things like the fault tolerance or failure tolerance and the reliability to make
Gotcha.
sure that the crew stays safe.
So that's it. Go ahead, Alicia, go.
Something else I was reading about too, in terms of kind of this backup idea, is like the ability to manually take control of the lander. So, you know, you've got the automated guidance system, but we saw what happened with Apollo 11 with Neil Armstrong, right? He's miles off course and has to actually manually control himself around to find a good place to land. So you guys will have that too, but at least with these Starship HLS, there's going to be some like long dark shadows and everything. What are ways that, you know, they've been able to pivot with that to make sure that they're going to be safe on that HLS system?
So we're still at the stage of development where we're working through those topics. So from a requirement standpoint, what we did is we wrote requirements that the lander both has to be fully autonomous and that the crew has to be able to intervene and take over manual control. And so like you guys can imagine, this is actually very complicated to be able to implement a vehicle that can both fly autonomously and be manually piloted. And so what we're, as the design gets further along, what we'll end up doing is spending a lot of time with the crew in simulators and going through different manual control algorithms and testing different lighting conditions and environments and vehicle response rates to be able to get to a point where it really is a vehicle that can both be autonomous but able to be operated by the crew in case something takes over.
I'm so curious, like the way that this works. And so I have a question. We talk about, like, say the elevator, right? And it needs to be this reliable, fail this many times, or this not fail this many times, like all these numbers and things, and how you prove that and calculate that, right? Are those requirements set in stone? Or could it be the sort of thing where, all right, now we've built this and here's what the numbers actually came out to be. Is there something where requirements could be slightly changed? I mean, at the end of the day, astronauts need to be able to get out of the vehicle and go do useful things and then get back into the vehicle and come home safely, right? That's the top requirement overall. But could things change? Like, could it be, all right, that's not quite as reliable as we had hoped. Could you put in a ladder too? Or something like that, like a mitigation.
A slide, maybe?
A slide, yes.
Yeah, I'll cover that. Part of it being involved in the early development of this program was, you know, we had to figure out what we were doing, and we wrote requirements back then. They have changed a lot. We've learned a lot either through what we call the base period, where we had 3 companies developing the lander together and doing full-scale mock-ups and analysis and getting smarter over time. And some of it is that for the later missions, we want to do more. And so those requirements have changed just for the later missions. So yes, they do change over time as we update our models, as we do testing, as we learn more details about the vehicles. They do change a little bit. Now, the change over time has slowed down a lot, especially our program management would like them to stop changing at all because changes are complicated.
They sort of solidify.
Yes, and they have, right? They've really, really solidified. Any changes now, you know, it can be a tweak to a word here and there. You know, do we say at least or more than, you know, that kind of stuff. So they have changed over time. Reliability and safety, of course, being number one. Those haven't gone very far, but they have changed a little bit.
Do they change based on, or I guess a question is, how often, hey there, we might have just lost the camera. We'll get that sorted in just a second. May need Logan to reconnect here. It happens with internet, folks. Folks join us from home and stuff like that. So all good. Give us just 1 second. I think we're back.
We can still hear you.
We've got Logan back, I think, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't want to ask Logan a question if Logan is like literally not in the call or can't hear us. But I think we're back. No, it's all good. It's all good. Folks, I can't say thanks enough. Like, when we get guests like this on the show, they're joining us. They're giving us time on their weekend. They're dialing in from home. Catherine, you're on a trip or something like that even. Like, just thank you all so much for dialing in and rolling with the punches when we get little disconnects and stuff. So, Logan, are those usually, like, when requirements change, what do they change based on? Is it because a provider comes back and said, yeah, that thing, here's how it's actually working out? Or is it NASA saying, oh, we really want that to work slightly differently? And I'm just going to sit here and smile while you answer in case we don't quite have your camera back yet.
No, I'm good. So it's both. Some of it can be that we go off and do, like I said before, we can go off and do analysis and we say, well, we want this kind of video down instead of this kind of video, or we want, one thing that we've been doing is we've learned more about how EVAs are going to happen. Of course, that's my world. So we didn't have requirements for how big the step height on a stair or or a ladder needed to be until we went and did testing. We wrote requirements with unknowns in them, and we said, we're going to get this to you later. And then we said, okay, well, we've done a bunch of testing. We now want the ladder height to be this far apart. So some of it's updates on our end, and then some of it is the vehicles going through and they say, okay, you told us to do X. We went off and did some analysis to show how we would do it, and we think it really should be Y. And again, we don't have to agree to it. There's a negotiation process. Maybe we end up with at Z,
Right.
but it can come from both ends.
Gotcha. It makes sense. And even that, you just said something that piqued some interest in my head. You've got the spacesuit, which may dictate how far an astronaut can raise their leg up, right? And then you have a step on a lander in the spacesuits over here designed by provider A, and the landers provided by B and C. And are you sort of the go-between there, or do they ever talk directly together? Or is it provider A says, here's how the spacesuit knee works, and then you take that over and you're like, we need to change the steps because of this other thing. Like, how does that communication between the parties work?
Yeah, so for a while, as far as the spacesuit, we had what we call a government reference design, where NASA internally had been developing the new spacesuit. We knew the EMU that flies on station was going to be retired. It's been working great for decades now, but we wanted a new capable spacesuit, and we got pretty far in that design. So we said, well, we think that this current design, the government reference design, can step up 6 inches. And go start working on that. But we're going to get back to you later when we know more about the new suit, the Axiom and then Collins suits. And now that Axiom is underway, they've gone through design reviews. They're talking directly to each other. Sometimes we're there and sometimes we're not. Sometimes they're just off talking to each other and making progress on the interface. If it has to do with the specifics of the mission or the requirements or more official things where you want the government involved, we'll be there. But they have direct contact with each other.
Gotcha. It's something I had never even really thought of before, but just the complexities of working with the multiple providers like that. And did you just let them talk? Still working on a technical issue with the cameras there, folks. So you're stuck with me for now. Hopefully I continue to look sort of interesting while I listen to the answers here. But more questions. There's so many questions. There's no way I'm going to be able to get through all of them. But here's one that actually came in via email. I normally don't take questions via email, but I thought that this was a fair question. And originally we had talked about working with these new providers, right? We're now going out to contractors and we're having these third parties provide these solutions for the services. And so that changes what NASA can actually release. But how has that changed? Because NASA has always heavily engaged with contractors to make this valve or this space shuttle or whatever. How is it different nowadays with the new commercial programs where we're engaging with those new providers than it was back during the space shuttle or Apollo, when still NASA used tons of contractors for that stuff? But it seems like we didn't have that same step where we couldn't get that information then.
Yeah, so that's definitely been a very interesting part of this program. So before the lander, I actually came off of working on SLS, and some of my very first jobs on SLS were on the RS-25s, which is the core stage engine that used to be the space shuttle main engine.
Yep.
And so if you go look at like the PR releases about the engine, we always provide like all sorts of metrics in terms of like thrust and fuel efficiency and mass and like all sorts of data about the engine. But part of how that worked is when the government has the contract with the rocket engine manufacturer, we do eventually take ownership of the engine itself, but we also had more explicit government rights to the data and specific design information about the engine. Whereas the way it works on our program, we heavily utilize something that we call proprietary data. And so that means that in a lot of cases, the provider kind of gets to decide what they consider to be proprietary design or technological information or engineering data about how they're approaching the problem. And that's more than just things like the diameter of a valve or the size of a certain part of the vehicle or something like that. It can even involve, information about how the vehicle flies and how long it takes to do certain events and all sorts of stuff. And so there's a lot of things that in the past, the real data restriction wasn't based on protection of the engine providers, like the contractors' information. It was more about like security sorts of protections. But now, because our goal is to really enable the providers from an economic or business sense, we view it as a very important aspect of that, is allowing the providers to be able to have their own trade secrets that they build their architecture or their business approach off of. So there's a whole lot more of the information that we as the government employees can't talk about, not because it's a big secret, but because we want to let the companies be able to decide what they consider publicly releasable information.
I gotcha. And I think that this sort of feeds into the next question I'm going to ask here. But that really does reframe it in a way I think a lot of people might not understand. In the past, NASA was having a contractor design this part for NASA, and then it's NASA's part. Right? It's NASA's engine, it's NASA's this, that, the other. And now it's not that, because you're really coming after it from like a services perspective. You're not asking a third-party provider to build you this rocket ship that will land you on them, and this lander or whatever, right? You're asking for the service, but the ship isn't yours. And where I'm going to go with the question is, and maybe this is the intention, the commercial providers don't just provide this service using this hardware to NASA. Are there any places where now with your requirements or with your contracts with the providers, they can turn around and they can also provide similar services to other commercial interests? A company wants a private moon base, and now they've developed this, and it's not just for NASA. Is that the difference here?
Yes. And then if you look at like some of what SpaceX has released publicly, they have a whole lot of plans for Starship that have nothing to do with NASA. Right, like they're really trying to build
kidding.
like a whole business. Yeah, like they're really trying to build like a whole business. But it would be like us talking about like the detailed information about the vehicle would be like having access to like Uber and Lyft's like deep down like core software programming.
Okay.
And then like communicating it to the others. So it'd be like taking like Uber's software code and being like, hey, Lyft, this is how like Uber's doing what they're doing. It makes it hard. It would make it very difficult for either company to be competitive from a business standpoint. Yeah. So it's really about enabling them to build like a broader business, because in the long run, that only helps the government and NASA's interest, because it helps bring the overall like cost of the service down, because we're not the sole funder of the entire set of like logistics and ground support services and manufacturing capabilities and all of like, we don't carry that entire overhead.
Right. And this is not NASA's language. This is my language, but it's almost like exclusivity for it, right? Previously, it may have been exclusive products or services or designs or whatever for NASA to use. And now it is not exclusive. NASA wants to purchase these, but in a way that helps drive down the pricing and help with the innovation by letting the third-party companies do it. It's not just exclusive to NASA. And I think that really reframes a lot, even just for me. Like, it makes sense to me that NASA should care about the details. Like, you need to know that the numbers are this, but they're not your numbers to release. They're not your details to release. You want to make sure that they fit your requirements. They're going to keep your astronauts safe. They're going to help accomplish the mission to your specifications, but it's just for you to review it, not to go out there and share them with everybody else.
Exactly.
And jumping off of that too, it's not just commercial providers like this, it's also other countries. Something else I want to make sure that we touch on before this is over is Gateway also, right? So Gateway down the line is something that NASA is hoping to use as kind of like an international partnership. It's going to be kind of essentially the first space station around the moon. They're hoping this will be this midway point for crew to launch from Earth to this point and then down and back up again. It could be refueling. It can be, to move all of the rocks that they get and everything like that. But this isn't something that's going to be needed for Artemis 3, right? Like we're not actually going to even have it yet. With Starship HLS, it's just going to be docking with Orion, right?
Right. It's what we call a direct docking mission, where it is just Orion and the lander and the suits.
So how
Gateway might be present in orbit, but we won't be interacting with it like when we're conducting the first mission.
So how will that match up then with plans for other upcoming Artemis missions? If you've just got the Starship HLS and Orion, are they going to start bringing up components of this International Space Station, really, for the moon? Are they going to start bringing up components with each subsequent mission?
Yeah, you can look at like the long-term campaign manifests or plans that the agency has released, and see sort of this incremental capability buildup process. And so the goal is to still be able to continue to, once we get to Artemis 3 and land humans on the surface, to with every mission still be able to land if possible or achieve other broader goals, but while still doing things on the mission that build up that longer term capability. So it's kind of a incremental development process.
Got it. So it'll be definitely a very helpful thing, though, to have in the future when we start building up our moon base, though, and talking about having these rovers and all of these long-term things there. And is the goal then with Gateway, I know maybe Gateway isn't necessarily HLS specific to what you guys are working on, but is the goal then to start, having this be the jumping off point for Mars and further afield?
I can't really speak to like that super long-term time frame with Mars. But at least for the lunar missions, that's a great way to describe it, is as a jumping off point where we'll be able to have logistics modules and other supplies that can be stored on Gateway versus what we have to do with Artemis 3, where it's just us and the crew capsule. You have to bring everything from Earth that you need on the mission, like on that specific mission. Whereas as we get these other capabilities developed, like up at Gateway, it'll allow us more flexibility within each mission in terms of how we use like the delivery to the moon amount of performance that we have to work with in terms of math. Like you won't have to take up all of your delivery maths with crew supplies, for instance, for that specific mission. So it's really about creating that, the orbiting base camp to help us be able to get to like having the base camp on the surface, kind of like how they do expeditions in Antarctica, right? Like you have different like waypoints and camps where you do kind of like an incremental journey to get to wherever you're trying to go at the South Pole.
I've got some more questions here, if you want me to hop into some more questions. Somebody told me that I needed to clear up the rental car analogy. There's one more mention of rental car. It's less of a rental car, but it's more of a space RV. And there's a reason I sort of...
That's fair.
I mean, if I'm from South Texas, right? And if I were to get into a rental car and it didn't have air conditioning, I'd be like, seriously? This isn't going to work. I would not drive a rental car around South Texas if it did not have working air conditioning. But clearly, yes, you need to make sure that the environment inside of your rental vehicle is suitable for the astronauts or whatever. I sort of just roll that in because I would not do anything with without an air conditioner. Another question here. Are there any specific requirements? Logan, you had mentioned that some of the requirements were based on experience with the Apollo programs. We've been to the moon. We've done that. We've gotten dust caught in spacesuit joints and stuff like that before. Were there any specific requirements for HLS that were sort of informed by that history or the ISS? I guess more of like an interesting thing. You're like, yeah, well, we learned that on the ISS, and so we applied it to this. Does anything like that stick out in your mind?
Yeah, it does. Working with the spacesuit, that's one of the biggest areas that I can think of. The Apollo spacesuit was what we call a single suit architecture, where they launched off Earth in that suit. They wore it the whole time. They did EVAs and they returned back in it. It was an amazing suit, But by being a suit that has to survive Earth launch and reentry and walk on the moon, it's kind of not as good at both. And so on these missions, we're going to have dedicated launch and entry suits on Orion, and then on the SpaceX vehicle, and then the EVA suit can be dedicated to EVAs. So you're not going to be in it for very long. You don't have to survive a whole bunch of complicated acceleration maneuvers and things like that. So it can be dedicated to the purpose. That's one of the reasons why they can do yoga in it, is that it has mobility features that you may not have on a suit that is only for you sitting in a chair. So the ability to separate those two systems is a big one. And yeah, being able to do more and more science, carry more, be able to walk farther, communicate farther than Apollo was all a big part of it. And then, yeah, dust is another big factor. A big lesson learned from Apollo is that we have requirements for how much dust can be in the air and how much we're going to bring in. That's a requirement that's on the suit. They have to figure out how to get the dust off the suit, because they're going to be kneeling down and rolling around and digging dirt, digging cores and everything. So it could be something as simple as just brushing dust off the suit, or it could be as complicated as air showers as they come in, either with just a handheld compressed bottle or something more complicated, just to get more and more dust out of the suit, since we know that it is dangerous not only to humans but to the vehicle.
I've
Something
seen that.
mentioned to us when we were talking earlier was talking about like the cabin pressure and the oxygen environment in order to keep them safe in that regard. Could you talk a little bit more about that too?
Yeah. So this is a fascinating piece of the mission that I work on. Apollo was 100% oxygen on board, and by having that high oxygen percentage, they could go do EVAs whenever they wanted. They didn't have any nitrogen in their blood. It's kind of the opposite of scuba diving, where when you go to a higher pressure and then you come back out of the higher pressure, you risk getting the bends. You risk getting bent, which can be problematic. Well, on EVA, it's the opposite. When you go outside to the lower pressure, that's when you have the risk of getting the bends. And so to do that, we want to have as little nitrogen in the air as possible, but we don't want to go all the way to 100% oxygen, because that's a very flammable environment. And so we're balancing that risk right now. We want to go out there and do long EVAs. Right now on the space station, their workday to do a single EVA is something like 17 hours, because they have tons of time to prepare for the EVA, do what's called pre-breathe, where you get the nitrogen out of your system, and then you can go do your EVA safely. Well, we want to do back-to-back EVAs, 8-hour EVAs in subsequent days. You can't do that if your workday is 17 hours. And so we're lowering the pressure and increasing the O2 percentage, but only to a certain amount where it's safe, so we can go do EVAs more while keeping flammability risk as low as we can.
You know, I have never thought of that before, but now that you say it out loud, it makes sense. If I were to guess, do you run the spacesuits at a lower pressure because that helps with mobility, versus when you're in the spacecraft or the vehicle, you can run a higher pressure because I don't know, is that more comfortable or whatever? Is that how that shakes out?
Yes, you want your spacesuit to be as low pressure as possible, exactly because of mobility. You're inside a stiff balloon. You want to operate around 4 psi in the suit. And inside the suit, you are 100% oxygen, since you have to be at that low of a pressure. So if you know your end point is a 4 psi, 100% O2 suit, Earth atmosphere is 14.7 psi, 21% oxygen. And what we're requiring for the later missions is what we call the exploration atmosphere, which is 8.2 psi, 34% oxygen. That's the balance point that we found through analysis and studying, where you get about a 20 to 30 minute pre-breathe, and then you can walk out the door. And usually you can be doing other things during that 20, 30 minutes, so you're not sitting in the airlock for a long time. Now, that's what we hope to reach. We're doing a bunch of analysis and testing right now to make sure that's safe. There's a ton of flammability concerns at even at 34%, which is not much more than 21%.
Right.
It's way less than 100%. It's still a risky environment. And also, there's science out there that implies that 16G flames work a little bit differently, and it may be worse in 16G. And testing 16G flames on Earth is not easy to do.
Right.
So we have a whole multi-prong year-long test program, both for what the suit can do, what materials we're going to use, what flammability looks like, just to be safe.
Gotcha. And was the exploration atmosphere, is that the vehicle atmosphere? And then it goes to the suit atmosphere, which is different. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Gotcha. Nice. See, this is why we like having these discussions. It's everything from where are we going with Artemis 2 down to, well, it's this percentage, and here's why we have to think about this. There's no way I can get through all the questions. I'm going to keep asking a couple more questions here. I'm trying to mix it up one way or the other. But here's one I want to address, and I sort of know part of the answer to this. So I'm gonna begin with the explanation and then let y'all fill in a little bit. I've seen a lot of questions come through. Oh, with this solution, how many times are they going to have to refuel it? Right. Well, I know a lot of people are really curious about that, but also remember what we talked about at the top of the show and sort of the recurring theme here. Does it matter? To NASA as the customer, they want to have equipment that arrives at the moon. It needs to have enough fuel to get up and down and do these things, and it needs to be able to transport people and all that sort of stuff. But I think that probably really comes into where we talked about, Catherine, you were talking about the risk assessment, like the reliability. And is there a difference between, well, if you have to refuel it 20 times versus you have to refuel it twice? That really feeds into your calculations and the numbers and the risks and reliability. Is that the right way to come about that sort of question without answering like, oh, well, it's supposed to be 6 or whatever?
Well, so this one's actually really interesting. We don't levy reliability requirements on the propellant aggregation process. Like Logan was talking about earlier, the vast majority of our requirements only kick in once the lander gets to lunar orbit and passes its checkout. The NASA big interest in the propellant aggregation process is more just a logistics and coordination thing in terms of being able to line up that, that preparation to get out to the moon with the activities that we're working on the ground, SLS stacking, getting everything ready to fly, and making sure that propellant aggregation sequence and the lander transit out to the moon lines up with when Orion and SLS is ready to go, which is actually a super, super complicated problem to try to solve because you're dealing with, not a small number of launches. As any spaceflight fan knows, trying to get things off the ground can be really challenging, even if your vehicle's like perfect in terms of things like weather and other extenuating circumstances. And so our big interest really is in, understanding, but not managing the number of flights that we're expecting for a given mission and the probability of those flights succeeding so that we know how to set out, pick out specific mission dates and do all the precursor analysis that has to be done to certify that the mission is safe to fly. So like Logan mentioned earlier, that's one of the reasons why we did put into place a requirement for how long the lander has to be capable of orbiting the moon after it passes its checkout review before we start the crew, really before Orion shows up, is to give us some margin there. But we don't actually specify anything about the design aspect of the propellant aggregation sequence at all.
No kidding. I had, I think about those things and it's like, oh, it's so important that this happens this way, but it's almost like this is built into the schedule, if that's the right way to put it, right? Like until that thing is ready to go and it's been delivered to the destination or checked out, like you said, we're not going to launch the humans until we have a very high degree of confidence that everything else has worked. Is that the right way to say that?
Mostly. So it's the part that makes this really challenging is that coordination aspect, right? Because we are working with architectures that do require multiple launches and propellant aggregation. We'll have to be careful about when that process starts and also making sure that SLS and Orion and the crew are going to be ready to go on time. Because, we also are dealing with cryogenic propellants, which boil up when they're in space. And so if you don't get that timing just right, it's not going to work. And so we, like you were saying, it really is, as much as anything, a logistics and schedule management problem that we have to solve in terms of getting all that, because there's so many parallel paths that have to, all come together and converge in order to be able to enable this mission and make it successful. So a big part of what's happening on the government side right now is trying to work with all those parallel activities and make sure that they actually all come together at the end of the day.
This is
And then-
go ahead. Go ahead.
On the other side of that, then, though, too, let's say after the Starship HLS has completed the Artemis 3 mission, everyone's back safe home and everything. What happens to that HLS? Because I'm pretty sure you guys are building or SpaceX is building a variant of it that's going to be slightly different for Artemis 4. So is Artemis 3's HLS going to just come back home again, or is it just going to explode on the moon, or is there plans for what to actually do with that ship? Or
So
use
this
it as
is
a tanker, or I don't know.
Or are y'all even involved with those plans?
Yeah.
exactly. We are not involved with those plans. Once the crew heads back to Earth and the Artemis mission is successfully over, SpaceX will be able to do whatever they want to with that lander. If they want to go do other things at the moon with it, they can. If they want to just dispose it, they can. If they want to try to reuse it, it's all entirely up to their discretion.
The exception
NASA has
being
no say whatsoever.
the exception to that being that they can't crash into an Apollo site.
That would
We
be.
do have disposal requirements about a couple things they can't do, but yeah, so it's pretty hands off at that point.
And trying not to hit future landing sites either, because we need as many of those as possible. So
Right. So again, to come all the way back around to the analogy of the rental car taxi, like if I got dropped off at the Intrepid Museum and the taxi drives itself into the Hudson, well, hey, I'm here, I'm good, or I made it back to the hotel at the end of the day or whatever.
not your
whatever.
problem.
Not your problem.
I try to film it for social media, but that's out of scope. And the same thing with the rental car. Once I guess in the rental car analogy, returned the rental car to its parking location, whether that's at the airport or whether that's in lunar orbit, right? The astronauts get out and they get on their merry way to go the rest of the way back home. What's the rental car company going to do with the rental car next? Well, in this case, it's not NASA's rental car that they purchased and it's sitting up there now. You're done with it. And what's going to happen is an answer for somebody else to give us, right?
Exactly.
I like it. I like this conversation because it's really firmed up a lot of the things. We like to talk about this stuff. A lot of people have very strong opinions about this stuff, but just framing it, and analogies aside, whether or not you like our analogies, I really do think that this helps with the understanding from a bunch of folks who maybe hadn't thought about it this way before. I do have another question here. Actually, I'm going to scroll up and find my other question because I wanted to specifically read it. We got through that one. Well, actually, we just sort of talked about that question because we went into what happens to. At least you asked my question.
Oh, I'm sorry, I did.
It's okay. It was such a good question. That was actually
just psychically linked.
And we went
At this
into
point, we kind of are.
we went into the description of what I was going to talk about, just naturally as part of the conversation. Anyways, let's see here. These are very exciting things that are coming up, right? I think the last thing that I want to sort of address here, because it's another big elephant in the room that a lot of people like to talk about, a lot of opinions on the internet, right? Why don't we just have one solution? You've talked about all this stuff, and okay, now we have to talk to these people about doing this, and we've talked to these people about doing this, and then they have to interface with each other, and then another provider is going to do this, and then why don't we just give it to one person and have them solve everything for us and remove all of these communication complexities and that sort of stuff? What do we get from this more diversified mission plan, architecture plan, that we wouldn't get if we just said, hey, here's a big check, just figure it all out for us? Who wants that one?
I'll take it.
It might be interesting if we both talk about it, because I'm kind of interested to see what Logan says too.
Logan, you're first.
Yeah, so a term that we use a lot around here is dissimilar redundancy. And so what that means is that instead of having one vehicle, one concept, we have more than one, and they're not the same. You can see on the picture here, one of them has an elevator on the left, and then the Blue Origin lander on the right, the crew cabin is right on the surface. So, we talk about having issues with an elevator. Well, Blue Origin isn't going to have one of those, so they solved it in a different way. So not only do we have two landers, we have two different spacesuits. We have multiple ways of doing the same mission, and each one brings strengths and weaknesses, challenges to it. So they each have different plans of how they commercialize. Is one going to send people around the moon, private astronauts, and is one going to be used for other things? So it's all about dissimilar redundancy. We don't want to have all our eggs in one basket. Once we get through Artemis 3, 4, and then 5, we'll have two qualified vehicles. They'll have uncrewed missions as well to prove that the vehicle is safe without crew on it. And then we'll have two proven vehicles to go from there to start building up the moon base.
I think it makes sense. What you said, dissimilar redundancies, right? Two different things that can accomplish the same task, but different designs, different ways of going about it, even different teams working on it, just options when it comes down to the task you want performed, right?
That's right.
Gotcha. Catherine, what do you think?
Well, so I think Logan nailed it, but I'll talk a little bit more about that dissimilar redundancy concept. And so a lot of what we do in engineering, right, is trying to forecast or predict what type of failures that we might experience. And if you think back to like the COVID timeframe, when everybody was having all of those logistics and supply chain issues, right? Like some of the supply chains recovered faster than others. And so like businesses that were able to get their equipment or their supplies from multiple different sources and multiple different geographic locations were able to fare a little bit better than the ones that were reliant on a single location that might have had a slower recovery time from COVID. And so what we're trying to do is address that exact problem, where if you have a particular type of failure or logistical issue, if the other system or the other thing you're trying to do doesn't have that same exact dependency on that same exact thing, if you lose that one critical thing, then you still have a system or a capability that can help you achieve your goals and objectives because it's not susceptible to the same types of failure. So what you're really trying to get at with the dissimilar redundancy is having systems that aren't susceptible to the same particular issues, whether that be supply chain issues or, God forbid something happened to one of the providers' facilities. Like if you have those dissimilar supply chains, then you're still able to like keep the overall Artemis campaign flowing and moving forward, and it's a lot less risk to the customer. Or in this case, like us as an agency, to NASA overall.
Yeah. And 100% fairly, because I see some folks talking about this in chat. This is also a balance as well. And it's sort of a move towards a new way of doing things. It doesn't mean that every single system in the entire program has dissimilar redundancy and we're going to farm this out to 3 different places or whatever. You have to make a balance. And so there are some parts of the mission that don't have that same sort of redundancy. And that's just part of the balance. Like maybe one day it'll get there. And I'd love to have 4 different providers that could get me to lunar orbit. Right. And I would love to have 3 different landers that I could choose from, 3 different companies that I could go to, and they could all do it because they've been doing it commercially for 10 years now or 5 years, 3 years, whatever. Like I'd love to get there one day, but that's sort of the direction that you're moving towards. It doesn't mean that everything is perfect out of the gate. Right.
Well, and it's like if you get down to the component level on each vehicle, like aerospace and space is a very specialized field. So you can have totally different designs, but in some cases there are, like, for instance, only so many materials that you can choose from to use in your valves or to use in other certain types of applications. And so like the companies could end up in a situation where they have totally different designs, but at the end of the day, they still have to go to like the same small company that supplies a particular material. And so even though like we will have like large scale, fairly robust redundancies, the aerospace industry as a whole still consists of a whole lot of really specialized companies who are really good at doing the one super complex thing. So the balance is a great way to talk about it. You'll never be able to get rid of all of those risks. And then in terms of like the larger scales, like our budget is set by Congress and we only have so much money to work with. And that kind of constrains how many lander providers that we have. And then the agency has to decide how to spread that money out across the program. So it is very, very much a balancing act.
Yeah, it does make good sense. We've run out of time. I always say we're going to run out of time. And then a lot of times the folks that we're talking to, they're like, how could we possibly talk for 90 minutes? We're going to run out of things to talk about in the first 30 minutes. But we are out of time for today's show. Folks, I know I didn't get to all your questions. There's questions that come in from all over. I tried to roll up questions where I could, and so we could cover some of these topics and things. And I hope y'all get a sense that we didn't shy away from some of the tougher questions here, because I know there's a lot of opinions about things about how things are going and how things work. But I really, really loved being able to explore some of the conversations here. And just I got a better understanding of how I can even frame some of these things in my mind, because it's not as simple as just like, oh, let's just write a check and we'll be on the moon, right? The work that y'all are doing, Catherine and Logan, really is a testament to exactly how much goes into the coordination to make these things happen, not even just happen, but happen safely and successfully. Folks, our guest today, really quickly, Logan Kennedy. He's the surface lead for NASA's HLS program. Logan, thank you so much for taking time out of your weekend.
Thanks.
And also Catherine Crow. She is the integrated performance lead for SLS. Catherine, thank you so much as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Did I get your title right? Did I get your title wrong?
It's for HLS instead of SLS, but you did get it right.
Did I say SLS out loud?
You did.
I'm looking at something that says HLS and wow. Okay. Anyways, for HLS. Sorry.
It happens to the best of us. Trust me.
It literally says HLS. It's not even typed wrong. Also, Alicia, thank you so much.
Of course. Love doing this. And thank you guys both again so much. This was a topic that we really, really wanted to bring to all of our viewers, and you made it happen. And this has been so wonderful. And like Dot said, I learned an immense amount, prepping for this show and talking to you all as well. So hopefully all of that information is getting imparted onto the masses now too. And we can't wait to see what happens in the future. We can't wait to see HLS come to fruition and bring our next people on the moon.
Yep. All right, folks. So that is going to bring us to the end of our show there. You know me. I'm John Galloway for NSF. The parting comments here, I want to just repeat. I know there's so many different people that have so many different opinions about the way that this works, but hopefully conversations like this help you reframe, help you think about things a little bit differently. Because remember, at the end of the day, there are tons of people who are doing a lot of work, and they put their blood, sweat, and tears into programs like this, making sure we can move ourselves into the cosmos, whatever you want to say, right? There are people behind these programs. So when you have your opinions, please make sure you watch shows like this, get a little bit better understanding for some of the thinking, some of the planning that goes into making these things happen. Make sure you follow whichever channel you're on. If you're on Intrepid Museum's channel over here with NSF, put some links in chat, etc., etc. Just make sure you can get back to here. We do these about once a month with the museum, the Astro Live events. Again, Astro Live is supported through a NASA cooperative agreement awarded to the New York Space Grant Consortium. I think that's the first time I've actually said that without tripping up somewhere. We've got stuff coming up next year as well, 2024. We're going to continue on the Astro Live things. Alicia, I think I'm supposed to keep an eye out for next month's show.
Yeah. So, well, like he was saying, we are going to have a whole 2024 full of exciting topics. But we also we're really curious if any of you all out there have any ideas for anything that you'd really like to see. Like, we have some ideas already brewing as well. But if there's anything out there that you are really excited about and you want to hear more about and you want to hear experts talking about stuff, let us know. Drop it in the chat. Let us know. Leave a comment or send us an email. You can go to our website, intrepidmuseum.org, of course, to connect with us. But yeah, let us know. We'd love to hear what you want to see. But yeah, we do have an exciting one coming up. It's not officially confirmed yet, but yeah, January 21st will be the next Astro Live with us.
Stay tuned. Stay tuned for January 21st. All right, folks, that's going to be the end of the show here. As always, thank you for watching. I did see a bunch of support for Intrepid Museum's educational programs come through as well. Thank you all for doing that too. For now, we're going to go ahead and shut it down, and we will all wave to the camera as we say, see you nerds later. Thanks for watching, y'all.
And here we go. We have liftoff.
Propulsion continues to be nominal.
RCPA chamber pressure looks good.
Following up. Roger, planet.
Water power supply! Yes! Tango down to nominal.
Fighting downside FD off. Bring in FD off.
It's orange!
Oh my God!
Decollage!
What is it?
Put that in the big bag, Signal.
343 unfolds to go.
Indeed. We rise together back to the moon and beyond.
If there's methane, it'd be igniting in the flare, correct?